The relationship between Saints Row 3 and 4 has been something that has fascinated me since before I was out of high school. When I first played Saints Row 3, I felt like a complete badass and learned to love and appreciate the world around me. I loved being in the world of Saints Row 3 so much that I found all of the collectibles and 100%ed the game without having that be an explicit goal. So, naturally, I very quickly moved to Saints Row 4, and despite it having the exact same map as 3, give or take a few variables, I was delighted to find out that it felt like a different game entirely. I wouldn't have been able to articulate this at the time, but the mechanics and overall aesthetic choices allowed me to see past the similarities between Saints Row 4 and 3, as well as the issues unique to 4, and view it as its own positive experience. The trouble began when I, on a whim, fired up Saints Row 3 shortly after finishing 4. The experience of playing Saints Row 3 suddenly felt a lot cheaper. At first, I chalked this up to not being able to move as quickly or do cool superpowers, but even after I played the DLC, which included a minor version of some of the superpowers, 3 still felt weirdly lacking. I haven't been able to play it since without comparing it unfavorably to 4. Ever since I first felt this way, this question has been rattling about in my head. If playing Saints Row 3 on its own felt so fun, what is it about 4 that changed the experience so much? And the answer lies in the relationship the player has with the game's world. So, real quick before we begin, this is not going to be a review of Saints Row 3 or 4. This is specifically a comparison video. If you haven't played either of the games before, you might be a bit confused by this review, but to put it simply, Saints Row 3 is a sandbox game similar to modern GTA games, but with a goofier tone and a greater emphasis on customization. Saints Row 4 is another sandbox game set in the same location, but in this game, your character gains superpowers like a powerful jump and throwable elements. This will all be explained later. Whenever a game developer makes a sequel to a game, whether intentional or not, the sequel will be making some kind of commentary about its prequel. This is a universal statement. Even if a sequel game is nothing at all like its predecessor, that too is a commentary. Everything from minor gameplay tweaks to graphical improvements to even the elements of a prequel that were dropped are done in some part through the lens of making the game different, and ideally better than the game that came before it. Saints Row 3 and 4 are a good example of a sequel re-examining and improving the relationship of the player to the world. They take some inspirations here or there, both from other games and from its own series, but one thing that stands out to me is what 4 takes from 3 and what it does specifically to improve on the same goal. Both games are about its world as a central focus, and 4 takes the same approach as 3 and applies some much-needed improvements to the player-world relationship. Some people may disagree with the assertion that both games are about their worlds and instead argue the games are about its characters and that it's a game about people. This is only true on a micro level. Moment to moment, the game is about the people the player character interacts with, but to say that the gameplay includes characters center stage and therefore is all about characters is missing the forest for the trees. The core of the game, both in terms of a narrative and a ludic perspective, is about pitting the player against the world. This is achieved in both a narrative and ludic fashion, and for the purposes of this analysis, it's worth talking about them as separate entities. If you haven't played either game, first of all, this video might make you go into them with a biased perspective, so I recommend even at this point that you play them before hearing what I have to say. As well, you'll probably get a lot more references and nuances of what I'm saying with the knowledge of your own gameplay experience. But if you want to ignore that, the Saints Row series is a series of sandbox games with the theme of gang-related or urban warfare that features hand-to-hand combat, shooting, and driving. As far as the narrative is concerned, it's key to understanding that the core of the game focuses around being a member of, and then later on being the leader of, a street gang. This is crucial to remember because Saints Row 3 immediately makes the world a key component of the story. The first two games take place in a town called Stillwater, which functions as the home base of the 3rd Street Saints. Saints Row the 3rd immediately brings you to a new town called Steelport, which is under control by a criminal organization called the Syndicate. After an intro where it's implied the 3rd Street Saints are out of touch and forgot what it means to be gangsters, and a mission to introduce the player to the gameplay, they're thrust into a city which is not controlled by the Saints, effectively making the setting itself a character, narratively speaking, that functions as an antagonist to the player. it's made very clear that the world is what you need to conquer, and you're the stranger in a strange land, so it won't be easy. In street gang terms, this isn't your turf, and you need to relearn how to be a gangster. In order to win, you must conquer the land itself. The game has given you reasons to go after the Syndicate's leader, Philippe Loren, mostly in cutscenes, but moment to moment, the main antagonist you're fighting is not a person, but the districts under Syndicate control. You do this by finishing missions, buying properties, and completing activities. All three of these things tie into each other, so you need to complete activities to finish the mission-based story, and completing missions unlocks additional activities, etc, etc. Properties you unlock helps you get more money, which allows you to purchase upgrades that can make the game easier and more bearable, and gives you protection from cops. All three net you parts of the area where your goons now patrol and own the streets. As a concept, this is interesting and engaging. Unfortunately, the execution falls flat. Buying one property, which you can do easily after minutes of gameplay, nets you control of an entire block, as does one activity, which will usually take you anywhere from 1 to 10 minutes. The narrative of the world being against the underdog saints that have to start over doesn't work. 4 missions in, you get a luxury penthouse apartment that functions as a base, probably to help the saints look cool and powerful. It's the second base you get. You have helicopters at your disposal, and an entire arsenal of weapons. This is mainly a case of the story wanting to have its cake and eat it too. The story insists the saints are badass and cool, and it's really hard to look cool and badass when you're underpowered and the world is crushing you beneath its heel. On the one hand, the saints are thrust into a new town which isn't their turf, and they have to start from the bottom. On the other, if the player runs into missions one after the other, they have access to satellite-guided missiles in under an hour of gameplay. It doesn't feel like the world is against you and you have to fight back against the world to prove your worth. It feels like the world is against an overpowered figure with near godlike powers that merely has to flick the world away to claim what's rightfully theirs. Very quickly, a player will stop seeing the world as this enemy they need to take down, and instead as a series of opportunities to get more money and feel like they own more of the city. Which is fine on its own, but it does the theme of player versus world no favors. Saints Row 4 attempts to both reuse the world of Steelport while also making you an underdog again through its plot. You become the President of the United States after saving the country from a terrorist attack in the game's opening mission, then aliens invade and kidnap you, sticking you in a Matrix-like simulation of Steelport. This simulation has the explicit goal of breaking your will, as well as those who are attempting to fight back against the alien empire. This would succeed if it weren't for the fact that the simulation has some errant code and bugs that your team manipulates and harnesses to manifest superpowers. These powers are used to overcome the challenges in the simulation, and as more of the simulation is wrestled from the aliens' control, the more you can do in the simulated world, and also the more you discover about how to better your situation while being held prisoner on the alien empire's ship. Clearly, the presence of literal superpowers means that Saints Row 4 will fall victim to a few of the issues of overpowering the character that occurred in 3, but surprisingly, the implementation of this world compensates brilliantly for this. The use of the simulated world being made specifically to break you and its implementation shows that Saints Row 4 better understands the concept of the world being against you. Moment to moment, you're still fighting the world with the ultimate goal of taking down its leader, but instead of being a gangster in a new world with overpowered weapons, you're a prisoner in a new world. Granted, with literal superpowers, but with a completely different relationship up front to this world. The aliens are not here to run their business with you in the way. They're here specifically to make your life hell. You still complete activities and do missions to win over areas, but now you're doing it specifically to fight back, not make the areas yours that you can control. You're fighting the world because you have a personal vendetta with it, and it's such a clever narrative choice because it works so well. It's about regaining equality and standing a fighting chance, not coming out on top, and that crucial shift in motivation makes the you versus the world motif so much more believable. Funny enough, the game where you get superhuman god powers sells you the underdog versus the world theme so much more successfully thanks to this setup. In Saints Row 3, during casual gameplay, you'll see a rival stronghold and take it down, usually single-handedly. You do this because there are gangsters protecting their land, but you want to own the land instead, because control makes you feel good and advance your status. It doesn't serve the underdog narrative. In Saints Row 4, you'll see areas that are functionally very similar strongholds, but in this game's framing, you're not killing random people that work for a guy your player character hates and taking their property. You are quite literally fighting the world itself. This is almost frustratingly good. On a micro level, concerning the characters, I kind of actually think the story of Saints Row 4 is a little dumb and underbaked, especially since the giant stakes they bring up out of nowhere.
You killed 7 billion people.
But on a larger scale, the themes of this narrative works in ways that simply aren't present in 3. Of course, while the underdog theme works better as implemented in Saints Row 4, this alone doesn't mean that it solves all of the problems in Saints Row 3. While narrative is important, the real make-or-break test of a player's relationship with the world comes from the gameplay itself. To be frank, both of these games don't do well to make you feel helpless. This is likely not an accidental consequence, and is more likely a consequence the designers accepted when making the game. The narrative presence of being one person against the world and yet feeling like an omnipotent badass is going to be, in most cases, a losing proposition. It's inherently contradictory, and it takes a thoughtfully crafted story to pull off, and even if Saints Row did put a lot of thought into its story structure, and again, that's an if, it puts a lot more effort into making it look like it doesn't care and doesn't take itself seriously. But that's mainly a point about how the narrative influences the gameplay in the world, so let's look at the world itself. Saints Row 3 is, most of the time, a game that only cares about 2 dimensions. There are 3 dimensions in its space, it is a 3D game, but most of the gameplay revolves around your player character fighting eye-level targets while existing on a flat plane. There's an influenceable x-axis and z-axis, but no real need to pay attention to the y-axis. Okay, so apparently some people with a background in engineering refer to the vertical axis as the z-axis and not the y-axis. So, for the record, for the purposes of this video, the y-axis will refer to the vertical axis alone. Even a lot of airborne levels will put threats at just your eye level. It's absolutely true, a lot of objectives will not be on the ground level, such as cars to be blown up by missiles and bad guys to snipe, as well as airborne enemies in later missions once STAG, the militarized police force, arrives. But the actual threats, until much later in the game, are either near eye-level entities or a restriction of time or health while you complete objectives. No matter what, most of the time, you're focusing on 2 dimensions, whether you're on the same plane as your enemies or on higher ground. Now, this is not inherently a criticism, especially since it's, in most cases, a reality for 3D games where the player is controlling a normal human. Humans can't fly. Most of us have accepted this. A lot of games, particularly sandbox games, try to get around this lack of willful manipulation of the y-axis by planning level design around using the y-axis as creatively as possible where it can. For anecdotal evidence, GTA 4 stands out to me as a game where, in a lot of missions, the player becomes very aware of their position in 3D space and how they can both use this to their advantage and how enemies can. Sadly, Saints Row 3 doesn't really plan around this, not to a noticeable extent. A lot of its enemies will exist on a plane, often the same plane as you at eye level, and achieving a victory state doesn't require a level of awareness in 3D space. Some missions will have you shooting enemies on a lower or higher plane than you, but it's only a difference of the plane with no substantial differences and no need to consider one's position in their 3D space. Even its more vertically inclusive sections like the snipers in the Trojan Horse mission where the penthouse is under attack show this lack of design. The missions on a whole don't have the player consider their vertical position to further their advantage. Using this section of the mission as an example, you stand on the roof and shoot people with markers on their heads. There's lower sections of the roof, but going there would be silly, as the angle would render a good number of the snipers unshootable. You're clearly meant to stand in one flat area of the roof and shoot people with a sniper rifle until they're all dead. Those are the only things the game seems to want you to be aware of. Contrast this with a mission like Harboring a Grudge from GTA 4. In this mission, you also start off on a rooftop with the goal of shooting marked enemies, but this rooftop is overlooking a ground level that you eventually have to make your way to, and there are unique advantages and disadvantages to your positioning. Staying on the roof means you're in the sights of a lot more enemies with not a lot of choices for cover, but you can also see more of them more easily. You also have the option of leaving the rooftop, losing the high ground to gain more cover and in some cases a vantage position against certain enemies. You're not just shooting people from a higher place with no real other options, you're choosing how to approach the situation with advantages and disadvantages to any approach you take. As a personal anecdote, the one mission in Saints Row 3 I particularly wish they made the height dynamic more important was the final mission where you save Shondi. You are traveling up a scaffolding on a very tall building, dodging enemy fire and, crucially, armed to the teeth with everything you got in the game. This would have been a good time to introduce, and I sadly do mean introduce, some combat where your height directly affected your level of advantage, but nope, it's basically several levels of eye-level enemies in a row. A Saints Row. Saints Row 4 changes the game completely, making the Y-axis a constant player in the game. Sadly, this still isn't reflected much in the mission level design, and that's still a glaring flaw, but the game implements a super-powered jump very early on, as well as introducing airborne enemies a lot quicker. This makes exploration an activity that is done in 3 dimensions instead of 2, more on that later, but it also means that a lot of the puzzles and activities feature a deliberate manipulation of the Y-axis a lot more in 4 than in 3. Unfortunately, one of the weaker things about 4's combat is that it usually doesn't use this Y-axis well. Most enemies are still usually at eye level, and super jumping away usually means that player is just leaving the combat area. That said, at least it affects abilities like the Stomp and Death from Above, but that only serves as an immediate temporary advantage to the player. All this said, Saints Row 4 has the coolest enemy for 3-dimensional fights, the Warden. The Warden hops in 3 dimensions and not only has attacks in all 3 dimensions, but also has certain attacks you can only dodge by using the 3rd dimension, aka jumping. As well as needing your powers in order to beat this challenge, the fight also requires you to be aware of your space, and speaking generally, you can't beat a Warden by only being aware of 2 dimensions and firing at eye level. To my knowledge, there is no enemy in all of Saints Row 3 that does this, certainly not to this level, mostly because you really can't manipulate the 3rd dimension, again citing the disadvantages of playing a human that doesn't have a Superman-level jump. At best, you need to be aware of where your enemy is in a 3D space in Saints Row 3, which isn't quite the same as utilizing all 3 dimensions in combat, or having good combat level design to complement this combat, but it's the next best thing, I guess. Combat appears to be a bit of a hit and miss when applied to this new approach to the world that Saints Row 4 introduces. Most of the time it seems like combat that could have just existed in 3, and that's not a good thing when you make fundamental shifts. But where the changes really shine is in the exploration of the world. Take collectibles, for example. In both Saints Row 3 and 4, the world map is chock full of collectible items that completionists can run around and gather. Collectibles are scattered across all 3 dimensions in 4, being on streets, on top of rooftops, and even outside windows or in the air. This also happens to a smaller extent in 3, but because of the lack of a direct way to manipulate the Y-axis in casual movement, the game uses collectibles placed in a particular way on the Y-axis, for example, on a rooftop, in a more cheeky way where they imply you need a helicopter. So, upon discovering the collectible, this only slows down the flow of play because you need to summon a helicopter using your phone, which doesn't always work properly. Upon replaying 3, deliberately collecting all the collectibles felt like a chore, and usually ended up with me flying over the whole city with a 96% completion rate, annoyedly flying over all the stuff I missed with a map implementation letting me know where all the collectibles were. I can't emphasize enough how much Saints Row 4 fixed this problem. The gameplay from moment to moment didn't revolve around walking or driving around on a fixed plane, but rather encouraged constant manipulation of the character's Y-axis to go from place to place. In collectathons like Super Mario Sunshine or A Hat in Time, this manipulation of the Y-axis is a constant necessity. Viewed from the specific lens of being a collectathon, which both games in the Saints Row series that I'm looking at arguably are, the lack of an easy way to manipulate the Y-axis in Saints Row 3 makes the process of collecting noticeably less efficient, and on a personal level, way less fun. I will concede that my first playthrough still had me collect virtually all of them by accident, so clearly the game has other strengths, and a love of the world itself will make this flaw seem much less important, but upon playing 4, it's made clear that this is a flaw. Saints Row 4 made the process of obtaining these collectibles fun in and of itself. Collecting rewards was a reward itself, and that felt cool. It felt badass. I loved zipping around collecting clusters. I loved running around at a superhuman speed, finding audio logs and going yoink. I loved the towers on the map that utilized 3D exploration and became a Y-axis obstacle course. I loved just flying around the world, and it was at this point that I remembered how grumpy I was going around the world in Saints Row 3. In 3, getting from point A to point B was like the commercial break during my favorite TV show. It was just filler. It was just a way to get from point A to point B, and it wasn't very fun, and I couldn't wait to get there so that I could start having fun. In 4, it was part of the show. Saints Row 4 took the side content from 3, made it a core component of the game, and made it much more fun. A big theme behind this improvement is interactivity, like how the player is even able to interact with the world around them. This is such an important part of why Saints Row 4 succeeds over 3 that despite it technically just being gameplay if you boil it down, I feel like the interactivity itself would need its own section for me to break it down. So let's do that. I want to stress again that it's not like having superpowers inherently makes a game better. A city setting doesn't automatically have better gameplay if you have a superpowered jump. Largely, this is just the gaping flaw of lack of coherent combat-oriented level design in Saints Row 3 being covered with a giant tarp in 4 instead of addressed, but in fairness, the tarp is a lot of fun. And, wisely, this is probably what led to the focus being shifted largely from combat to collection. I should emphasize that this is a point of contention to some. A lot of people that don't like Saints Row 4 don't like it for its collectathon elements, and lament a few mechanics being undermined by the overhaul of moment-to-moment gameplay. Cars are basically obsolete, so collecting and customizing them is largely pointless. Saints Row 3 had a large emphasis on cars because that was how you got from point A to point B. The trouble of playing a game where you drive cars in a city after playing a game where you use superpowers to zoom around what is almost the exact same city is, you're now aware of how much less of the city you're interacting with. In 3, when you're driving your car across the street, you're rarely thinking about the buildings as buildings. You're often thinking about them in a 2D way. Functionally, Saints Row 3 has a bunch of rectangular prisms you get to look at and go around. You can get on top of them, but you can't get on top of them without getting into a menu and praying that the helicopter cooldown has gone through a full cycle, waiting for the helicopter to arrive, getting in the helicopter, making the ascent, then either parking or diving out of the helicopter to get to a roof that, in a lot of circumstances, is some variety of flat plane that doesn't have anything of value on it. Even then, you have to wait for the privilege of the game saying yes to you gaining access to the method of vertical ascension. But in 4, it takes seconds to do this, as opposed to the minutes in 3, but more importantly, the ability to do so quickly changes your relationship to buildings. They're no longer rectangular prisms that are placed on the ground that you could explore if you made a conscious decision and had a few minutes to spare. They're something you mindlessly scale as part of the environment. This is huge. If I see a building in 3, I'm usually thinking about going around it. If I see a building in 4, I'm thinking about what collectibles might be on the roof, or whether I want to go around the building, or cutting across the roof. I have options. That feels good. Yeah, there might be a collectible on a building in 3, but you're not thinking about that whenever you see a building. You're not seeing it in that way. Your relationship to the world is, compared to 4, stunted. This could also be solved by making the buildings more interactive, like making more buildings explorable from the inside, which other sandbox games like even Saints Row 2 implement well. Sadly, in Saints Row 3, it's noticeably lacking, and the only buildings you can meaningfully explore are explicitly part of missions later on. Buildings, for the most part, are just things that you drive your car around. It's a series of walls blocking off a small section of the world, and not a part of the world you'll interact with directly on a more meaningful level. Buildings are just an example here. This use of 3D space affects traversal in Saints Row 4 in a number of ways. Take water for another example. In Saints Row 3, if you somehow end up in the middle of water without a vehicle, you have two options. The first is to slowly swim to shore, hoping to find some place where you can climb up and rejoin dry land. This option is so slow and frustrating that the developers just added a kill switch. Press a button, warp to shore. The map has a lot of water in it, and it's so devoid of fun, they added a get out of water option. In Saints Row 4, water is still kind of useless, which was a missed opportunity, but instead of ordering your butler to move you, you can leap out of water and fly away, or, later on in the game, just walk across the water like you're Dash from The Incredibles. Water has joined buildings in the league of things that impeded movement in Saints Row 3 but became part of the cohesive world in Saints Row 4. Still working on the title. It has to be said that transportation also feels better in Saints Row 4 because it's faster and uses sounds and visual effects that make it feel cooler. It may be tempting to write off the use of superpowers as a cheap gimmick that adds a superficial level of quality because it feels nice and gets you to places quicker, which helps the game flow a bit smooth, but that's ignoring how the world design responds to this method of travel. It's not like the game accidentally made travel faster and cooler and also made the world more dynamic and explorable. Those two things are related, and they were deliberate choices to make the game better on a whole. Remember that these two games use the same map, almost the exact same. It's not like one world had a fundamentally easier map to traverse. Volition and High Voltage just found a better way to use that map. It understood that by using all the dimensions of, for example, its buildings, it could make the world more enjoyable. If collectathons aren't for you, I can understand that the emphasis on collectathon elements in Saints Row 4 may have turned you off of the game, but that point only works on the basis of personal taste. In terms of making better use of the world, which is the point of this analysis, even by the merits of getting from point A to point B alone, 4 towers over 3. Again, 3 has a lot of elements of collectathons too. Think of your favorite collectathon. Most of those games use the world and its space in similar ways to Saints Row 4. Height is a crucial part of their puzzles, challenges, and rewards, and it's super easy to change your height, unlike some games we know. Saints Row 4 combines the elements of collectathons like Banjo-Kazooie and Spyro, such as in-game incentive to explore the whole map and an emphasis on verticality, with the combat elements of 3, and attempted to find a happy medium between the two. By all means, if I want to feel like a badass and ride around in a cool car and use surface-to-air missiles, I enjoy Saints Row 3. But in terms of examining the question of which game did more specifically with its world, both narratively and gameplay-wise, the answer is clear. As mentioned, it's not like the travel and exploration elements of the game, as well as the narrative of the world, were made separately and happened to work together or something. This game feels like a love letter to the idea of Saints Row 3, especially after its DLC, The Trouble with Clones, which approaches these same themes. Without obsessing over the development history of these two games, it feels from the outside like the developers took a good long look at 3 and told themselves that they were going to rework the core concepts and fix everything that made 3 not work, particularly in its least exciting areas. And personally, I think they did a really good job. So in this section, I want to rattle off all the cool things that worked really well and cohesively with these fundamental designs. A really underrepresented but important aspect of a game's world is the color direction and lighting. I absolutely love the lighting in Saints Row 4. I love how instead of 3's system where you needed to look for your goons on the sidewalk to be able to tell if you overtook a neighborhood without looking at the map, the lights would tell you. Red if it's owned by the aliens, blue if it's owned by you. The thing that pushes this from cool to amazing is that this is as good an indicator if you're far away or flying over the neighborhood, which is something you are doing constantly. This was the perfect way to communicate friendly versus hostile territory to the player. Okay, so this really veers away from provable arguments and goes hard into subjectivity and taste, but I loved the progression of getting your powers in this game. Saints Row 4 starts you off by basically giving you Saints Row 3 in the Matrix, to the extent where you're even still driving cars. Each new superpower took me by a little bit of surprise and made me feel the same incredulous giddiness that my character felt. And when you're feeling the same way as the character you're playing, clearly the dev is nailing the cohesion factor and doing a lot of stuff right. Plus, it meant that my adaptation to the new ways to explore the world was incremental, and not just all at once, meaning the game's reward system as well as the tutorial period for each of these abilities felt constant without being overwhelming. I looked forward to playing more of the game purely on the basis of seeing what the game would throw at me next, because I knew that each new add-on would change how I interacted with the game, instead of giving me just a new way to kill people. The second half of Saints Row 4 was weaker in this way, and largely did just give me new ways to kill people. And also, I kind of wish you got to see your powers for the first time in a world you were in and not some training program, but for conveyance purposes, I do get why it was done this way. Hey, Saints Row 4 critics, this one's for you. I liked the real-world missions. Some people didn't, but I did. It provided me with a narrative reason to reject the world instead of looking at a world where I got my superpowers and going, I got superpowers? I'm staying here forever. Plus, the game constantly withholding my powers made me more grateful to use them. I get this is a poor argument for the game being better, so I'm not going to argue the real-world sections made for a better game. I'll just say it made the game more fun and appreciated given my particular playstyle. Lastly, the activities are so much better. In 3, a lot of the activities felt repetitive and some had interesting premises but did not have an engaging gameplay loop. But in 4, the races were fun, the insurance fraud minigame was now at least interesting instead of a frustrating mess, and not only was the Genki minigame fun, the commentary was so good that I frequently lost time bonuses because I was too busy listening to the commentators talking. The overhaul in the player's approach to the world clearly did more than serve collectathon elements. It had positive effects on mechanic-heavy sections of the gameplay as well. Thanks for accompanying me on the Self-Indulgent tour. The point of this analysis is obviously not to say that all sandbox games should have a Superman jump. Sandbox games can work really well when their designers are keenly aware of all aspects of their design. Again, I cite the tight level design of GTA 4, which didn't have a meaningful way to manipulate the Y-axis immediately, and so implemented planning around the Y-axis and so much more into its level design. Video games, especially sandbox and open games, tend to be hit or miss when it comes to their world design. Saints Row 3 is a good example of a game that's still really fun that I enjoy, that didn't really use game design to its fullest ability, especially when it comes to level design. Did Saints Row 4 overcome this? Not really, but it did compensate in a lot of important ways, and its use of the world as an antagonist in both a narrative and ludic sense remains probably as its strongest design aspect. By changing how the player interacts with their world, they made a fundamentally better, more dynamic world. And, I can't stress this enough, they took a world that, in my opinion, wasn't fun to get across and made getting across it one of the most fun parts of the game. The way they changed the world's relationship to the player made a stronger product, and shows how world design is such an important and often overlooked aspect of game design, even in AAA products. If you're a budding developer and the idea of how to create a more dynamic world interests you, I really recommend you play both of these games and see for yourself what I mean. See where you agree and where you disagree. The making of a world is often underrepresented when talking about games, especially in relation to a game's combat or how it affects the player just by existing, and despite its flaws, Saints Row 4 deserves a bit of a spotlight for doing a lot of things right. In August of 2021, Deep Silver announced a reboot of the Saints Row series, slated to come out in August 2022. In the few examples of gameplay we've seen so far, it's clearly going back to its ludic roots, so expecting a super jump would be ludicrous. At the same time, I feel like Saints Row 4 has shown a lot of the competency the teams had at understanding what makes a world work, even if level design was overlooked. When the Saints Row reboot comes out, I'll be hoping that it's its own game, but I also hope it'll carry more of the world design choices of Saints Row 4 rather than 3. Even with standard driving and shooting mechanics more evocative of 3, an emphasis on level design and a use of the whole world will go a long way, and I've already seen some promising footage that they will keep this in mind. The last thing I want is for the greatest choices made in designing Saints Row 4 to turn out to just be flukes.
Saint's name used to mean something more than body spray and some ass-tasting energy drink.
Our brand's worth a shitload of money.
Is that what it's all about?
If you have any thoughts on the Saints Row series, particularly any that play off of any of the themes in this video, I'd love to hear them. Because of the nature of the themes I was covering, I had to leave a lot out of this discussion, especially stuff about the first two games, and I'd love to hear any supplemental thoughts, so leave a comment. Also, the best way to help support a guy in their first video like this is to do the YouTube dance and subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with anyone you think would enjoy it. Thanks for your time.